Hello everyone, I am going to show you my first ever time lapse, me sculpting a character from One Piece named Luffy. He's the main character and is quite fun from a design perspective. Here you can see I'm using Blender for everything. I'm going to just kind of talk you through each aspect of what I'm doing. Hopefully it's helpful to someone out there. In general, sculpting with Blender, I use the remesh feature a lot, and then every now and then, like you can see with the ears, I box model different elements. I like to have all my references open and just viewable so I can take different pieces from them and start to get the basic shape and pose that I want down. Whenever I sculpt characters, since I'm still fairly new at it, there's always this uncertainty feeling in the beginning during this stage. Is it going to look good enough? Is the likeness of the character going to match what the fan art is based off of? So I'm just trying to block out different shapes and see if I can get something decent. For this sculpt in particular, I'm using cylinders and having the character be in pose from the get-go. Sometimes I would try and model in an A pose and then rig and pose it after the fact, but since I know I'm not going to use this work for anything but a still render, I'm just going to pose it right away, and that'll help me make sure I can accentuate the forms I want in the pose. And you can see I open up another tab with Google Images to just see more reference that may be beyond what is in the original work of art in One Piece. Took me a little bit to figure out how I wanted the legs to be posed, and I was looking at different jumping poses. You might have saw I had like Google search for Michael Jordan doing a dunk and seeing which leg is bent upward and which arm is upward to try and get it to feel as natural as I can. And you'll see some elements like the teeth and the ears. I keep it box modeled the whole time. But the main elements of like the head, the hands, the body, the arms, those will all be sculpted, and I'll be using remesh over and over to try and get a little bit more density as the overall form is being created. This is going to be a long video, so there's going to be lots of times I'm just not going to say anything. Leave room for the video to play. The beginning of the sculpting process is always the scariest for me because it's hard to know if it's actually gonna come out okay or not. With this one, once the face was looking good, I felt pretty confident about that, but the overall pose and how the whole composition would come together was a bit unknown at the time. And you might have seen also I merged part of the arms and the legs, basically the thighs and the biceps. I merged into one mesh already, and then separately now I'm doing the hands, and you'll see eventually toward the end I'll merge that as well. But in particular for like hands or like shins or even forearms, I like to keep it separate for as long as possible so I can really get the pose right without having to maneuver the bent joints too much, because I find like belt and elbow with like the inner crease can be quite difficult to resculpt over and over, so it's just easier to keep it separate. So I took one hand pose from one of the reference images where he's holding his hat from the back, and another one where he's kind of waving his other hand outward, and I just combined it into a new pose where both of them, or both hand expressions are in the same image. Here I'm going to start doing the feet and the shoes, so I pulled in some more reference images. Yeah, I think in general, feet and hands are still the trickiest for me. I'm still trying to get the anatomy right. I think in general, a lot of my hands and feet look a little swollen or large, so I'm trying to get better at thinning out different areas and being able to see the underlining structure and skeleton in it. You'll see I revisit a few times to get a little bit closer. If you do end up liking this type of video, please subscribe or leave a comment. It'd be helpful for me to know if this is actually the type of video that you'd want to see. For this character, I kept the hands and the feet slightly bigger than I would with other characters, just because of the cartoonish nature of this character. And here you can see I'm starting with the hair. I usually use kind of like a hair cap and then a bunch of splines. I think in Blender that might be called just paths. And I taper it with another path object. And then it's really helpful for posing. And I try and go about it with working on a few clusters at a time, so you can kind of see there's only 3 or 4 pieces of hair per object. And I try and have them kind of all flow in a similar cadence. It helps me map out the hair. In general, I think hair is probably my weakest standpoint still. You'll see eventually with this, I actually keep the mat cap or the hair cap on, and I use a shader so you can't really see where the hair strands and the cap begin and end. But in general, I'm trying to move more toward it all being splines. Grooming hair is quite challenging though, so I'm still studying and trying to get better at this. And here in general, you can see I'm just trying to match a silhouette from the reference image directly behind. The face was still looking a bit wobbly, so I upped the resolution of the remesh so I could hopefully get a little bit cleaner form there. You can see around the mouth it's still wobbly, so later on I'll remesh it at an even higher resolution. And you'll see I kind of add spheres, whether it be in the shoulder blade or the wrist, because eventually when I do a bool union, which you just saw me do, it helps basically just fill that form. So when I start to smooth and add clay or virtual clay to that area, it makes it a little bit easier and quicker. If I didn't have that, there would be kind of like this indent that then I would need to fill and remesh and fill and remesh until it was right. This is me creating a nail. I was originally using the snap to surface. I don't know what you call it, constraint or part one of those magnet tools in Blender to try and position the nail quicker. But actually in Blender, was it 3.01? That constraint is a little bit broken. I know they fixed it in the newer version, the beta version that I have, but I happen to be in 301, so I just continued and I manually positioned each nail. When I first started learning to sculpt characters, I didn't really do nails at all. I don't know, it didn't seem like a necessity, especially when dealing with stylized characters. But after enough characters, you kind of realize they do add a lot of realism, even though it's like a really subtle, small detail in a model. Finally gonna start adding some clothes. I think I started with box modeling, but then I quickly turned it into a sculptable mesh and started doing the remesh on it that I was doing with the body as well. One of my favorite things about Blender is hitting the forward slash and you can go into the silo mode, so you can sculpt on something without having all the other geometry around. I find it super helpful. Here I was trying to figure out how I'm going to get the seams in the model. There's another YouTuber I follow or subscribe to that does time lapses, and I kind of stalled their technique where I get the main mesh as good as I can get it, and then I'll eventually use a multi-res modifier and then do the little seams in the multi-res. So the scene will still perform well from I don't know, navigation or file size perspective, but then I could also get some micro details in there, and it can be real details rather than just like a bump map. And back to the foot anatomy to try and get it to look a little more realistic. Even though it is a cartoon and a stylized character, there are parts of the anatomy that you still want to get right. I up-res the face a little bit more so I can finally smooth out the lip area. If I didn't do that and I render it, it would have looked a little jagged. You'd see some issue with the normals and some weird shadowing around the lips. Here I'm finally merging all the parts of the body together. Cleaning up some anatomy. Kept searching for how the knees and the elbows look, because there's little bone bulges on the left and right side of them, and it's hard to remember exactly how they're supposed to look. And I think here I'm doing a quick lighting test with the sun, and then I have an area light on the left and right backside, and I kind of did the classic red and blue, warm and cool tones on the left and right. Here you see I'm doing the multi-res thing that I talked about earlier. I'm eventually going to undo all this and do it again from scratch, because I realized that I should have had, I forget what it's called, but something like smooth cursor or lazy cursor. I forget what Blender calls it, but it eventually allows me to have much cleaner lines. See, right there, I just deleted my multi-res and made a brand new one. That's one nice thing about multi-res as well. I can do all these details and redo it really quickly without having to mess with the base mesh that I spent a while on already. Here I'm tweaking each belt hook just so it doesn't feel like a copy paste. This is me just trying to get all the materials on to start to understand how it's looking, how I want to light it, what the background should be. Merging the fingers finally. That was the only thing that was missing. And here I'm vertex painting the inside of the mouth, which I'm then going to use in a shader to color it. I could have done texture painting, but because it's all like a high-res Blender remeshed object, it's not the easiest to do like clean seams. I'd have to kind of retopo it for that, so using vertex paint was a lot easier. And for the scar in the body, I just use a texture map. And then you can see I just UV that one area of the chest. And again, I'm vertex painting just to use kind of a mix RGB to know where the texture should read from. And I'm also adding some noise inside, so the scar just feels a little more, slightly more realistic, or at least a contrast in texture. And now I'm starting to think about the environment. Since he's a pirate, I thought it could be fun to have a little bit of a wood plank that he's jumping off from, or some wood flooring. And here I'm creating a shader that is dynamic so that each plank of wood would have different grain, different offset, as well as different scale of the grain. Took me a little bit to figure it out, but using the object info node, I was able to get something pretty decent. Eventually, I end up not using the wood flooring. I do still think it's quite cool though, so maybe I'll bring that back in a future project. You'll see it actually takes me quite a while to do the wood flooring, because I edit almost all the planks so they have a little bit of variation in terms of like the ends and the little nooks and crannies of them. Right now I'm doing all the visual development with Eevee on, and eventually for the real render I'm going to use cycles. It looks pretty good with Eevee and has like a toy quality to it, but with cycles you can just get really, really clean ambient occlusion, so and shadows, so the different areas feel a little more distinct. So when I can, I prefer to use cycles. Looking back on it, I'm surprised actually how long the wood flooring took compared to everything else, and I ended up throwing it out. So it's kind of funny. Feels like I made a lot of progress pretty quickly with everything else. Here I'm testing out two different cameras. One is a wide angle and the other is a longer lens. I feel like with anime stuff, wide angles can be super cool just to accentuate some of that energy. But I ended up going for the long lens just because from a 3D object or model perspective on a turntable, I think it's a little easier to view and more appealing to view with the long lens. I think for like a quick animation or even like a still frame, the wide angle might have worked better, but for showing off the whole model, I preferred the long lens. And in general, I think I used 100, I forget what unit of measurement, centimeter or millimeter, I don't remember, but the lens of 100. That's generally my go-to long lens. And here I'm testing out how I want to texture the clothing. I was originally thinking I could kind of make the clothing hyper-realistic, so I was trying different little bump maps to give it that texture. I ended up removing it just because since it's kind of this anime style, I thought it actually looked a little better just keeping it with the basic shader. There are a few things in the shader. It's not all just like default, but still, I ended up not going for the hyper detail. I think if I were to do the hyper detail shading, I should have done a little bit more detail with the sculpting as well, in terms of like the seams and the pockets. So here I render it out with the wood flooring, and I realize there's some things missing. With modeling, I used to be a little bit too much of a perfectionist. You can kind of see here, this is all just like eyeballed and done by hand. I used to want everything to be very precise and exact, but I think when you let go of that, it actually gives it more life, the handmade nature of it. And in real life, I mean, most things like these sandals are oftentimes not like manufactured by a machine. So having some things about it that aren't perfect can actually add to it. So I ended up getting rid of the wood planks, and I went for kind of a light box feel, which is just like a rectangle with a subdivision surface modifier on it. And here I made an extra plane to catch the shadow, because I wanted that subdivision surface light box to be an unlit shader, just so as you rotate it feels like a consistent color. When I had a principled BSDF on it, it would kind of pick up the light at different angles and distracted from the main focal point of what I was trying to show. I did add back little bits of rocks just to give it a little bit more expression and depth, so you can kind of see he's a little bit in the air a little better. I ended up noticing that I had subsurface scattering on the fingernails, which ended up making it look really weird, so I just turned that down. And here I'm trying to add a kind of an anime sheen to the hair. And I'm going to end up using a layer weight, so based on the angle you're looking at, the sheen will appear or not appear. Still thinking about seams, just because I thought the back of the pants felt a little plain, but because of the way the front of the pants are, I ended up not adding an extra seam to the back. Lots of little cleanups, but it's almost done. Testing out some post effects, playing with contrast or bloom. Ended up removing all of it, so it's just a raw render. In general, I think Blender can sometimes make things look a little washed out, so I like to try tweaking with the colors just to see if it helps. And this is my last tweak, just like adding a belly button and a little more definition to the body. Again, if this video is helpful, please subscribe and leave a comment. I will make more of these if they are. I have a lot of fun making characters, and by the end of this year, my goal is to get 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. So please follow along.